What happens when an undercover boss walks into his own restaurant and stops cold after hearing what the waiter says? Let's dive in to see how one day can change everything. James Whitmore sat at his office desk, staring at the latest financial reports for Whitmore Bistro, the restaurant chain he had spent the last 15 years building. The numbers looked good. Sales were steady, profits were growing, and customer satisfaction scores were decent. By all traditional business standards, things were running smoothly. And yet, something didn't feel right. James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had started Whitmore Bistro with a dream, to create not just a restaurant, but an experience. A place where people felt welcomed, where employees were valued, and where good food wasn't just about profit, but about bringing people together. But as the business expanded, that personal touch seemed to be fading. He spent his days in corporate meetings, reviewing spreadsheets, and handling logistics, far removed from the actual restaurants where real interactions happened. He sighed and glanced at the framed photo on his desk. A picture from 15 years ago, the day he opened the first Whitmore Bistro. He stood in front of the small, cozy restaurant, his apron dusted with flour, grinning next to his first employee, Laura, a kind-hearted waitress who had believed in his vision before anyone else. That was the Whitmore Bistro he wanted to keep alive. Lately, though, he had been hearing complaints from employees. Some whispered about difficult managers, others about stressful shifts and low morale. Could it be that his business had become just another corporate machine? James needed to know the truth. Not from reports, not from managers, not from customer reviews. He needed to see it himself. And so, an idea formed, one that he knew could change everything. He would go undercover. James knew that if he simply walked into one of his restaurants as himself, everyone would act differently. Employees would be on their best behavior, managers would scramble to impress him, and no one would be truly honest. So, he needed a disguise. He decided to pose as a new trainee waiter, sent in as part of a corporate evaluation. He grew out his usually well-groomed beard, let his hair become slightly messy, and swapped his tailored suits for a worn-out flannel shirt, jeans, and an old pair of sneakers. His assistant, Karen, wasn't thrilled about the idea. "You're really going to do this?" she asked, crossing her arms. "You want to pretend to be a waiter in your own restaurant?" James smirked. "Exactly," Karen sighed, shaking her head. "This is either the best idea you've ever had, or the worst." James chuckled. "I guess we'll find out." The next day, with his disguise in place, he chose a location. Whitmore Bistro, Branch Mer 5. It wasn't the biggest or busiest restaurant in the chain, but it had always been one of his favorites. Located in the heart of the city, it attracted both regular customers and newcomers. More importantly, it had a reputation for great service and loyal staff. If there was a place to test the true Whitmore Bistro experience, it was here. As James parked a few blocks away, took a deep breath, and adjusted his cap, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: excitement. This wasn't just a business move. This was about rediscovering the restaurant he had built, and finding out if it was still the place he once dreamed of. The morning air was crisp as James Whitmore walked toward Whitmore Bistro, Branch Number 5, the restaurant he had chosen for his undercover experience. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon drifted out onto the sidewalk as he stepped inside. The familiar warmth of the restaurant wrapped around him. But today, he wasn't here as the CEO. Today, he was just another trainee. He approached the front counter where a middle-aged woman with a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor was checking the schedule. Her name tag read Denise, manager. James had read about her in reports. She had been with the company for nearly 10 years, running this branch with discipline and efficiency. "Can I help you?" she asked without looking up. James cleared his throat. Yeah, I'm Mike, new trainee." Denise finally glanced at him, taking in his scruffy beard and casual attire. She looked unimpressed. Corporate didn't mention anything about a new hire. James forced a sheepish smile. "Yeah, I think it was kind of last minute, some new training initiative." Denise sighed. "Fine, you'll shadow Daniel today. He's one of our senior waiters." She turned and waved over a young man in his mid-20s, balancing a tray of dirty dishes on one arm while wiping down a table with the other. Daniel approached with an easy smile. "You're the new guy? Welcome to the funhouse." James chuckled and nodded. Guess so. Daniel handed him a small notepad and pen. All right, first rule, stay out of Denise's way. Second rule, always keep an eye on your tables. And third, if a customer calls you over, smile, even if you're dying inside. James laughed, but as the shift began, he quickly realized that Daniel wasn't joking. The restaurant was busier than he expected. Morning customers streamed in, office workers grabbing breakfast, retirees sipping coffee, young parents struggling with fussy toddlers. James had assumed waiting tables would be easy, but by the end of his first hour, his arms ached from carrying trays and his mind spun from trying to remember orders. Daniel moved through the chaos effortlessly, greeting customers by name, joking with regulars, and making sure each table was taken care of. James couldn't help but be impressed. But then, something caught his eye. An elderly man sat at a corner table, pushing his plate away. His shoulders were slumped, and his expression was one of quiet embarrassment. Daniel noticed too. He walked over, spoke softly, then reached into his own pocket and pulled out a few bills, discreetly tucking them under the man's napkin. James's stomach tightened. Daniel had paid for his meal. The elderly man hesitated, looking as if he wanted to refuse, but Daniel gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. James watched as the man's eyes welled with tears before nodding in gratitude. For a long moment, James stood frozen. He had come here to evaluate service, efficiency, and morale. But he had just witnessed something far more important. James continued his shift, but his focus was no longer just on learning the ropes. His mind kept drifting back to what he had witnessed earlier, Daniel discreetly paying for the elderly man's meal, as if it were just another part of his routine. James had built Whitmore Bistro on the values of excellent service, quality food, and community. But nowhere in the employee handbook did it say that a waiter should be spending their own money to help a customer. Why would Daniel do that? As James continued shadowing him, he noticed something else. This wasn't a one-time thing. Later that afternoon, a young woman and her son entered the bistro. She looked exhausted, her clothes slightly worn. They sat at a booth, and she hesitated before ordering, double-checking the prices on the menu. Daniel approached them with a warm smile. "Hey there, buddy," he greeted the little boy, kneeling beside the table. "You look like a pancake kind of guy." The boy grinned shyly. His mother let out a small, relieved laugh. Daniel took their order, but returned to the counter, pressing a few buttons on the register before subtly reducing their bill. James caught the move immediately. When the food arrived, Daniel slipped a small card onto the tray, a free meal voucher carefully placed next to the mother's coffee cup so that no one else would notice. James watched as the woman's eyes widened. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. Daniel simply smiled and walked away without waiting for a thank you. James had seen enough. At the end of their shift, as they stepped into the employee break room, James decided it was time to ask. "You didn't have to do that," James said casually, leaning against the counter. Daniel glanced at him, confused. "Do what? The elderly man? The woman with her son? I saw what you did." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's nothing, man. Just helping out where I can." James studied him. "You do this often?" Daniel shrugged. "People are struggling, you know? I see it every day. Some folks can barely afford a meal, and I've been there myself. I know what it feels like to have nothing. If I can make someone's day a little easier, why wouldn't I?" James's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that answer. "So you pay for their food out of your own paycheck?" James asked. Daniel chuckled softly. "Not all the time, just when I can." James fell silent, absorbing his words. This wasn't just kindness. This was sacrifice. And he was beginning to realize that Daniel deserved far more than he had been given. James left the bistro that night deep in thought. He had come into his own restaurant undercover, hoping to understand the real experience of working there. But what he found was something much deeper. Daniel wasn't just a great employee, he was a genuinely good person, quietly helping people who needed it without expecting anything in return. Over the next few days, James kept a closer eye on Daniel, and what he discovered left him stunned. One evening, a man in his late 50s entered the bistro, wearing an old jacket and scuffed shoes. He sat at the bar, staring at the menu with hesitation. James, still in disguise as a trainee, watched as Daniel approached him with a friendly smile. "Welcome in, sir. "What can I get started for you?" Daniel asked. The man hesitated. Just a coffee for now." Daniel nodded but didn't walk away. Instead, he leaned in slightly. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice low enough so that no one else could hear. The man looked embarrassed. "I don't have enough tonight, just the coffee." Daniel smiled. "Well, lucky for you, we've got a special menu for our favorite customers." He pulled out a notepad and scribbled something down. "How about a hot meal on the house? I promise it's the best dish we have today." The man looked at him with pure gratitude. "You don't have to." "I insist," Daniel said before walking toward the kitchen. James couldn't believe what he was seeing. Daniel was running his own personal charity inside the restaurant, without telling anyone. And the most incredible part? He wasn't looking for recognition. He wasn't doing it to impress a boss, to get tips, or to earn points with customers. He was simply doing it because it was the right thing to do. James had spent years expanding Whitmore Bistro, turning it into one of the city's most respected establishments. But now, he was starting to realize that success wasn't just about the food, the ambiance, or the reviews. It was about people. And somehow, Daniel had understood that better than anyone. That night, James made a decision. He wasn't just going to reward Daniel for his kindness. He was going to change his life. The next morning, James arrived at the bistro earlier than usual. He sat in a quiet corner, sipping his coffee, thinking about what he had seen the night before. Daniel's actions weren't just an occasional good deed. This was something he had clearly been doing for a long time. And not just for one person. James started asking around subtly. He spoke with the kitchen staff, the other servers, even a few customers. The same story kept repeating itself in different ways. "Oh, Daniel? He's one of the kindest people here," one of the line cooks, Marco, said. "A couple of weeks ago, he saw a young woman crying outside. Turns out she had lost her wallet and didn't have money for dinner. He brought her inside, gave her a full meal, and even gave her enough cash to get a ride home." Another server, Vanessa, nodded. "Yeah, he's always doing things like that. Last winter, he found out one of the dishwashers was walking 2 miles home in the freezing cold because his bus pass had expired. Daniel just handed him $50 and told him to take care of it." Even some of the regulars had stories. A retired teacher, Mrs. Reynolds, smiled when James asked about Daniel. "That young man? He's got a heart of gold. My husband and I come here every Sunday, and one time, when my husband was in the hospital, Daniel wouldn't even let me pay for my meal. He said, 'You've got enough on your mind. This one's on me.' Who does that anymore?" James listened carefully, taking it all in. It wasn't just a one-time thing. Daniel had made it a habit to help others, no matter how little he had himself. James knew what he had to do next. He called his assistant, Leah, and asked her to gather some information about Daniel. She hesitated at first. James never asked for personal details about employees, but she knew him well enough to trust that he had a reason. A few hours later, she called back. "James, I think you'll want to see this in person." They met at his office later that afternoon. Leah placed a folder on his desk and took a deep breath. "Daniel's had a tough life," she began. "His parents passed away when he was a teenager. Since then, he's been taking care of his younger sister, Emily. She's in college now, and Daniel works long shifts to support her." James frowned, flipping through the papers. Daniel was practically raising his sister on a waiter's salary. Leah continued, "He's been turning down promotions because he doesn't have the time to take on a management role. He's afraid that if he works more hours, he won't be able to be there for Emily." James leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Daniel had been helping everyone around him, but he never asked for help himself. That was about to change. That evening, James sat in his office, thinking about everything he had learned. Daniel had been carrying a weight that no one had noticed, all while continuing to help others. It wasn't just an occasional act of kindness, it was who he was. And now, James needed to figure out how to help him without making him feel like a charity case. The next morning, James arrived at the bistro early again. This time, he didn't just watch. He observed closely, paying attention to how Daniel carried himself. He worked hard, always moving quickly between tables, always smiling at customers. But James also noticed the exhaustion behind that smile. Daniel was running himself into the ground. and yet he never hesitated to put others first. The opportunity James had been waiting for presented itself just before lunch service. A woman at a corner table looked uncomfortable, checking her purse repeatedly. James watched as Daniel approached her. "Everything all right, ma'am?" Daniel asked gently. The woman sighed. "I thought I had my wallet with me, but I must have left it at home. I'm so embarrassed. I already ate, and now I don't know what to do." Daniel's response was immediate. "Hey, no worries. It happens to the best of us. This meal's on me." The woman's eyes widened. "Are you sure? I can come back later and pay." Daniel shook his head with a kind smile. "Don't even think about it. Just come back and visit us again sometime." James felt a wave of admiration as he watched the exchange. Daniel had no idea that his boss was sitting just a few tables away, witnessing everything. After the woman left, James knew it was time to act. He motioned for Vanessa, one of the servers, to send Daniel to his office. A few minutes later, Daniel walked in, looking slightly nervous. "You wanted to see me, sir?" he asked. James smiled. "Yeah, take a seat, Daniel." Daniel hesitated but sat down. "I've been watching you these past few days," James began, his voice calm but firm. "And I've learned something important. You're not just a good employee, Daniel. You're an incredible human being." Daniel looked confused. I don't understand." James leaned forward. "I know what you've been doing, helping customers in need, covering bills out of your own pocket, supporting your coworkers, and I also know that despite all of that, you've been struggling yourself." Daniel stiffened, his posture instantly defensive. "Sir, James held up a hand. "Relax. You're not in trouble. Far from it. I called you in because I want to help you." Daniel shook his head quickly. "I don't need help. I'm fine." James sighed. "That's the thing, Daniel. People like you never ask for help, even when they need it the most." Daniel swallowed hard but didn't say anything. James reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an envelope, placing it in front of Daniel. "This is for you." Daniel eyed the envelope warily before picking it up. When he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a fully paid scholarship for his sister's remaining college tuition. Daniel looked up, stunned. I can't accept this." James met his gaze. "Yes, you can, and you will, because you've spent years helping everyone around you. Now it's time for someone to help you." Daniel's hands trembled. "I don't know what to say." James smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just keep being the kind of person who inspires the rest of us." For the first time, Daniel let his emotions show. His eyes welled up, and he exhaled shakily. "Thank you," he whispered. James stood and extended his hand. "No, Daniel, thank you." The following evening, as the restaurant wound down for the night, James sat at his desk, still thinking about Daniel. The young man had dedicated his life to others, sacrificing his own comfort to make sure people in need were cared for. But now, James had the power to make a lasting difference. The next morning, he arrived even earlier than usual. Instead of heading straight to his office, he made a few calls to HR, to his financial team, and even to a local university. Then, he waited. When Daniel arrived for his shift, he seemed even more exhausted than usual, but he still greeted his coworkers with a smile and jumped straight into work. James watched as Daniel helped an elderly customer to their seat, carried an extra tray for a struggling coworker, and refilled coffee cups without being asked. Every action was small, but it spoke volumes about the kind of person Daniel was. By mid-afternoon, James knew it was time. He asked Vanessa to bring Daniel back to his office, and a few minutes later, the young waiter walked in, wiping his hands on his apron. "You needed me, sir?" Daniel asked. James gestured for him to sit. "Yes, I did. I have something important to tell you." Daniel hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair across from James. "Is everything okay?" James smiled. "More than okay. Daniel, I've been thinking a lot about you these past few days, and after seeing everything you do, not just for this restaurant, but for people, I decided I can't just stand by and let you keep struggling." Daniel frowned slightly. "Sir, I don't." James raised a hand. "Just listen. No arguments." Daniel shut his mouth, though he still looked uncertain. James leaned forward. "First, I want to officially promote you to restaurant supervisor. You'll be earning a higher salary, which means you can finally take care of yourself, not just others." Daniel's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" James chuckled. "I'm not done. I also spoke to my financial team. As of today, your sister's college tuition is fully paid off. You don't have to worry about that burden anymore." Daniel stared at him in stunned silence, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. James continued, "And one last thing. You told me you've always wanted to open your own restaurant one day, right?" Daniel nodded numbly. James reached into his desk and pulled out another envelope, placing it in front of Daniel. "This is a business mentorship program enrollment. You're going to start learning everything about running a restaurant, management, finances, operations, so that when the time comes, you'll be ready to open a place of your own." Daniel's hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. He looked from it to James, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Why? Why are you doing this for me?" James smiled. "Because people like you deserve it, Daniel. Because you've spent your whole life giving, and now it's time for someone to give back." Daniel blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. I don't know what to say." James stood and extended his hand. "Then don't say anything, just keep being you." For a moment, Daniel hesitated. Then, with a shaky breath, he reached out and gripped James's hand tightly. His voice wavered as he whispered, "Thank you." James nodded. "No, Daniel, thank you." Word of Daniel's promotion and the generosity James had shown spread quickly throughout the restaurant. The staff whispered about it during shifts. Customers who had been touched by Daniel's kindness in the past expressed their gratitude, and even the kitchen staff, who rarely got involved in front-of-house affairs, congratulated him. But Daniel was still struggling to process it all. The following day, as he tied his apron and prepared to start his shift, he was stopped multiple times by coworkers who clapped him on the back and told him he deserved every bit of it. Vanessa, wiping down a nearby table, grinned at him. "Told you that good karma was coming your way." Daniel chuckled, still feeling slightly overwhelmed. "Yeah, but this much? I never expected." "You should have," she interrupted, crossing her arms. "You've been taking care of everyone else for so long. It was about time someone took care of you." Daniel didn't argue. He just smiled and nodded before getting to work. But even as he took orders and served customers, something felt different. The weight he had been carrying for years, the financial stress, the worry about his sister, the uncertainty of his future, it had lightened. He still had responsibilities, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't drowning in them. That evening, after closing, Daniel took a seat at the counter with a cup of coffee, staring down at the steam rising from it. He had always been the one offering kindness to others, yet now, for the first time, he was on the receiving end. And it wasn't just James' generosity. His coworkers had started looking at him differently. There was more respect in their eyes, more warmth in their interactions. As he sat there, an older man approached and settled into the stool beside him. Daniel recognized him immediately. Mr. Lawson, a retired teacher who came in regularly. He always ordered the same thing, a simple cup of tea and a small plate of toast, nothing fancy. Daniel had often covered his bill when he noticed him hesitating at the register. "You've done good, kid," Mr. Lawson said, his voice raspy but kind. Daniel turned to him, startled. "What do you mean?" The older man chuckled. "Word travels fast in places like this. Everyone's talking about what Mr. Whitmore did for you." He took a slow sip of his tea before setting the cup down. "But they're also talking about what you did for them. You might not think much of it, but trust me, those little acts of kindness, they mean something." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. He had never expected anything in return. He had never kept count of how many meals he had quietly covered or how many people he had helped. He just did it because it felt right. Mr. Lawson patted him on the shoulder. "You keep being you, Daniel, and you'll go far." As the older man left, Daniel sat there for a long time, staring at his coffee, deep in thought. Maybe Vanessa was right. Maybe all the good he had put into the world was finally coming back to him. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. And so, Daniel's quiet acts of kindness had transformed not just his own life but the lives of those around him. What started as simple gestures, covering a meal for someone in need, offering a helping hand without being asked, had grown into something much greater. It had created a culture of generosity, of compassion, of understanding. The restaurant was no longer just a workplace. It was a place where people felt valued, where customers were more than just orders on a ticket, and where employees looked out for one another. And all of it had started with one man who never stopped believing that kindness, no matter how small, could change the world. Daniel's journey had shown that the impact of a single good deed could ripple further than anyone could imagine. It wasn't about recognition or rewards. It was about doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. Because in the end, success isn't just measured by how much money you make or how high you climb. It's measured by the lives you touch along the way. And Daniel had touched more lives than he would ever know.
If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one.